Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We're happy to return to the program and have an opportunity to put forth what some of the Republicans were doing when the Democrats invaded the place in 1974. We have a distinguished panel today. We have Don Wolfensberger, who's been around for a long time, 28 years service to the House of Representatives. We have Bill Pitts, another 28 years service to the House of Representatives, and Mickey Edwards, who can talk about what happened afterwards and what were some of the unintended consequences, as we heard a few moments ago, that there were many as a result of the of the reforms.
And so I came on that summer of '65 not knowing what to expect. I was assigned by my boss, John Anderson, to cover the reform hearings of the Joint Committee on the Organization of Congress, which was looking to a congressional reform bill later in that Congress. Also to attend the meetings of the task force on reform that Gerald Ford had appointed, and to write a chapter for a book on reform. So it was really a reform summer. John McCormick was under a lot of pressure from Mo Udall, who was going to run against him for Speaker, and so McCormick kind of relented to some of the Democrats who were very interested in congressional reform, and you had a big group of them. You had a freshman class, I think, of about 71 that had come in the election of '64, and so these were young members that were also interested in the television age and some other things. So the interesting thing was that there was a group, a bipartisan group that was working on these reforms, and they co-sponsored the amendment on the floor to, for the first time, have recorded votes in the Committee of the Whole on amendments. It's hard to believe that we'd gone through all those years of our republic with non-recorded votes on very important amendments. And so that was passed. But, you know, on top of those, I think that group won 9 of their 10 amendments. One was on having recorded votes in committees to close meetings and hearings. That went down, so that wasn't resurrected for a couple more years, but that was eventually put in 1973. But they did very well, the bipartisan group. So lo and behold, come the next January in '75, the Democrats came out on opening day with their rules package, and what should be missing? Well, 2 of the things that were sweeteners for the minority in '74 were, once again, 1/3 minority staffing, investigative staff funds, and banning proxy voting, which was another big issue that the Republicans had championed. So one of the things that I have noticed throughout, and into the '80s too, was that Republicans were very much interested in reform. There was always going to be a task force on congressional reform of some kind that was created in the Republican conference. They would reach across the aisle when they could to try and get some of these things. But to end this story, by 1993 and '94, another Joint Committee on the Organization of Congress was formed, bipartisan. Lee Hamilton and Bill Gradison were appointed the House co-chairs, Domenici, Republican in the Senate, and David Boren were the Senate co-chairs. Gradison decided to retire and go on to another job, so Dave Dreyer took over. But that became a big partisan battle, as Dave Obey remembers, and both parties had their attack dogs on that joint committee. So it was pretty clear that it was not going to go real far, but Dreyer and another Republican provided the votes to keep the process alive. It went to the Rules Committee, and into the markup on that, a phone call was made from Speaker Foley to Joe Moakley saying, pull the plug. So the plug was pulled on that. The good news is that most of those reforms that Republicans had been pushing that weren't in there, and some of the reforms were in the package that Lee Hamilton had reported along with Dave Dreyer, but all of those reforms ended up in the Contract with America congressional reform package the next January when Republicans took over. So there are happy endings. The downside is that while many of the reforms were geared to make committees more responsible, a little more powerful to balance off with the leadership, Newt Gingrich had another idea and became the new prime minister, as you may know, for a while. I like the taste of optimism, not cynicism. That's a bitter taste. So you keep plugging.
The U.S. House of Representatives, a place I love, and it's where As Ron mentioned, I worked most of my life, and I worked on the floor of the House almost all 28 years. I say that outside of Washington, and they think I laid carpet. I worked with Bob Michael most of my career, over 20 years, as whip and as leader. A great man, a consummate legislator, and he always operated in an atmosphere of open-mindedness, mutual respect, and trust. But the modern Congress keeps getting criticized for having a Hastert rule motivation. Now, I looked up to see what Speaker Hastert said, and he said the job of the Speaker is not to expedite legislation that runs counter to the wishes of the majority of the majority. It sounds reasonable. Well, the dignity of history is in reciting events and presenting people and their actions with truth and accuracy. Therefore, the fundamental element of history is truthfulness. So those reforms of the 70s that we've talked about came to a standstill in 1980 with the election of 1980, losing over 4 years from 291 to 192, and now having a Republican president and a Republican Senate with Howard Baker in charge. Speaker O'Neill was the highest elected Democratic office holder, and he was told that he had to make sure that only Democratic policy was enabled and enacted. So this is the way it went. The Budget Committee reported out their budget resolution under Budget Chairman Jim Jones. They brought it to the floor with their proposal. The next day, the rule that got reported from the Rules Committee didn't make our substitute in order. It divided it up into 8 separate amendments. So we ended up defeating the previous question, offering our substitute, and we were able then to have our substitute made in order to the base Jim Jones bill. And Bob Michael kept on. He could see by the complexions of the members on the other side that they know this is a wrong thing to do, and our leadership would never put up with it. But Tip O'Neill couldn't resist, and we went forward and won the amendment. But we're about reform and trying to make the House a better place. And the one area where I think we've really gone astray is the power of the purse. And Dave Obey mentioned the failed budget process, and it needs fixing, there's no question about it. The appointment of members is one idea, just dealing with macro figures rather than functional categories is another idea. There are several ideas out there, but the appropriations process is also broken. So the American people are now disenfranchised through the appropriation process. The entire budget is voted on in one vote, up or down, the entire omnibus appropriation, all the agencies. They can't say they don't like IRS or they want more for foreign aid, and it's become a party thing. It has to be fixed.
We're now going to hear from Mickey Edwards, who's vice president of the Aspen Institute, obviously a former member of Congress. And from 1977 to 1992, he'd been on the Appropriations and Budget Committees.
Well, you know, one of the things I wondered was, am I the only former Republican member who would come here to praise the class of '74? But I do, and I'm kind of going to divide what I'm saying. There was a period, the early period, right after the class of '74. And then what transpired after. And the other thing is that, as many of the members know, you know, the staff usually knows more than we do. And so, you know, a lot of the gamesmanship that Don and Billy saw and were ensnared in trying to undo, you know, that kind of went over my head because I was really new. And so, You guys apparently, from what I have heard about the class that came in 74, knew what you wanted to accomplish. You had an idea clearly of what changes you wanted, the reforms, what was happening, what needed to happen differently. So let me tell you what it looked like, though, to me. When I came in, I truly revere the Democratic class of 74, and I do because as a member, coming in, what I found was the Congress of the United States as I had anticipated it would be, not knowing anything different. I had never served in any other office. I had never run for anything before. And I walked into a situation where, even though I was in the minority, and we were a small minority, we were players. We could speak, we could offer amendments. There were it was open rule, and we could get up and we could make our case, and sometimes we won. But where we could sit together and not bemoan, not complain, but strategize and figure out how are we going to take our case to the floor, get a chance to make our argument, get a chance to have a vote on it, and that was the way textbook a United States Congress was supposed to work. And I say to your class, the 94th Congress class, you made it happen. I walked into a Congress that I could be proud of being a member of, and I really appreciate that. You know, when Tip left and was replaced, and the nature of the institution began to change, and the effect on minority members began to change. And there may be people in this room who admired Newt Gingrich and the contract with America, and there may be people here who thought that he did a great deal of harm, but Jim Wright created Newt Gingrich. Jim Wright was responsible for Newt Gingrich's rise to power, and the closed rules and the semi-closed rules that all of a sudden the people who had rallied around a Bob Michel, and Billy described him perfectly, rose up. I don't know if y'all are aware that Newt got elected by the moderates in our caucus, by the moderates, because they wanted to be players. They wanted to offer amendments and so forth. So the Congress of the United States and the House of Representatives are not support staff, not an ancillary to the executive branch. If American exceptionalism has any meaning, if there is anything that defines what is American exceptionalism, it's Article 1 of the United States Constitution that says the power of the purse, the power of going to war, the power of regulating commerce with other countries, the power of governing the armed forces, every single one of those powers belongs to the people who serve in the House of Representatives as the delegates of the people themselves. And that's lost. And the separation of powers, the ability of the people through their representatives to keep a check on the executive, not to be loyal to the president. No member of Congress should be loyal to anything except the Constitution, their constituents, and their conscience, not to a president and not to a political party. And that's been lost. So as somebody who loves the Congress, loves it, it is so bothersome to me to find a Congress that I find impossible to cheer. Either party. It's not one party or the other. So this is not about party. This is about both parties. You know, all of you fought so hard to make the U.S. House of Representatives the place where American democracy could flourish. And guys, we have lost it. It's gone. And we have to do something to get it back.